President Muhammadu Buhari no doubt has a daunting to-do list in the next 4 years, having been re-elected as the #1 man in Nigeria, from reviving an economy still struggling to recover from a 2016 recession to tackling insecurity, particularly in the northeast part of the country. Well, having been re-elected for the second term, so much is expected of him. Let's hear from operators in the real sector. I'm being joined by the Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Muda Yusuf. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. So, what's your views? What, in your view, are those things the present administration of President Buhari is doing right, that needs to be sustained in this second term? Let's just start, from
Yes. Before I go into that, let me also just make some reference to the report from Tempo.
Okay, the conversation there.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
about the equities market,
and
the bond market. Yeah.
The trend,
or rather the fixed income market. Yeah.
The trend from that report is that there's a flight from areas of risk to areas that are not that risky.
Risk-averse
Risk-averse investment. And what that speaks to is the very important need to raise investors' confidence. It's about confidence. When there's a migration from areas where, because investment is about risk, and the more you encourage investors to take risk, the better for the economy. So it is very important that as we step into the new phase of the administration, we build confidence so that more investors will be able to take risk. We want to see more people in equity. We want to see more investment in foreign direct investment and all of that, rather than going into fixed income market. Because investment in equities have more value for the economy. Because you are talking about job creation, you are talking about tax revenue and so on, rather than fixed income market, which is just escalating the borrowing of government. So I think that is very important. Now, coming back to the issue about what the government has been doing right. Of course, the government has been doing quite a lot of things right. Fourth, we had the quality of engagement between the private sector and the government in the last 3.5 years has been very good, especially with the economic management team led by the Vice President. We have had very useful engagement. We also have very good, also with the Vice President's office, the PEBEC office, that is the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council. The performance has been excellent. The lady, Jumoke Oduwole, has been doing excellent work in terms of trying to deal with issues of the investment environment. Because it is one thing to have the macroeconomic environment right. It's another thing to have the right kind of investment climate. How the institutions are relating to you. How they are doing things, how policies are consistent, how the bureaucracy is relating with business. And so a lot is happening in that space. And we want to suggest or appeal that we need to scale up the momentum in that space, especially with regard to the ease of doing business agenda of government.
Yeah.
That is very key. Now, talking generally about the economic management philosophy, because that is also very important. There are two major gaps in economic management issues in this economy. There's the issue of funding gap. Because even the president said it when he presented the budget. The Minister of Budget and Planning has said it repeatedly, that this administration has major problem with funding. The Director of Budget has also mentioned it. So there's a major issue to be dealt with in the area of funding. And funding is a function of revenue. If you don't have the revenue, you cannot fund some very critical projects. And already we are getting to an elastic limit in terms of borrowing. Because our borrowing threshold now is at a level that one is not also too comfortable with, especially when we look at the proportion of revenue that we use to service our debt. So we need to create an environment for the private sector to support the government in funding. We need to strengthen our public-private partnership and identify things that the private sector can fund, and the government should step back. Secondly, there is also a gap in management competencies. in whichever area the private sector can support the government in the area of management of enterprises. We should have a framework for that. Thirdly, there is also the important element of signaling, because signaling affects confidence. Signaling impacts expectation of investors. Now, if you look at the main policy document of this administration, is the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. And it is clearly stated in that document that this administration will drive for a private sector-led economy so that we can have more investment, because private sector brings a lot of things into this economy. Imagine a Nigerian economy without private airlines, for instance. Imagine a Nigerian economy without private telecom providers. Imagine a Nigerian economy without private investment in education. Imagine a Nigerian economy without private sector investment in healthcare, in transportation, in agri, in manufacturing. So the private sector has a major role to play. Because I'm saying this because I've seen some, what look like some ideological rhetorics, especially at the party leadership level, not given the right kind of confidence in terms of what the private sector can bring to the table. The private sector can bring a lot to the table in terms of tax revenue, if you create the right environment. It can bring a lot to the table in terms of job creation. This economy in the private sector accounts for over 80% of jobs that are created. And this administration also needs to create jobs. It is one thing to create jobs directly, but it's more sustainable when you create jobs through investors. So it is very important that we give the right kind of signals. And in terms of communicating with investors, I will advise that it is better that we get those who are in charge of the economic team to communicate to investors. Because when the party people are making statements, which is at variance with what the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan is saying, it could create some confusion among investors. So we have to streamline communication on critical investment policies in terms of what direction the government is going in some critical areas. For instance, in the area of foreign exchange, pronouncements should be coming from either the central bank or from the leader of the economy, which is the vice president. Communication is very important, and all these things are very important for confidence building in an economy. I think I need to just emphasize that point.
Well, while you were talking, I was wondering what point agenda you are giving now. Is it 5-point agenda? My guest yesterday gave 10-point agenda. No. Anyway, talking about the business environment, now let's look at some of the issues now there and what you think this new administration of President Buhari would do differently. Let's begin with the issue of tax policy and multiple taxation.
Yes, you see, I talked about investment. The way to encourage investment, because we are doing, our growth rate level is not good enough. It's far, far below the population growth rate. And that speaks to even the welfare of the people. Because if the growth rate is so weak and the population is that high, at almost at 3%, it's not a good trajectory for the economy. So one way to also deal with this investment issue is through the tax policy. Granted, tax is essential to support government investment. But tax can also be an instrument to stimulate investment. In some other climes, for instance, in the United States, there was a reduction in company tax. Recently, the manufacturers had an engagement with the Federal Inland Revenue Service director, and they were clamoring or canvassing for a reduction in corporate tax. Sometimes, when you reduce tax, it doesn't mean that your revenue is going to reduce. It can be revenue neutral. Because you have more compliance, you have more investment, and invariably, your revenue will increase. So we should see it through that prism. So it is not all the time that you'll be aiming at raising high taxes. We should identify sectors and make sure that the tax regime is investment friendly. We should be looking more at expanding the tax net rather than increasing the tax. Because I've seen some suggestions by government about a month or two ago talking about increasing excise duty and all of that. We should impose less burden on investors, because what is happening in this environment is that the investors are facing a greater burden of taxation. And it's supposed to be the other way around. Because you need the investors to even increase your tax base. The more money an investor makes, the more it's likely to invest. Because the propensity to invest among entrepreneurs is very high. If an entrepreneur doubles his or her profit, the likelihood is that he's going to invest more. He's not likely to eat more food or buy more clothes or buy new cars or marry more wives. He's likely to invest more. So the more you encourage investors to do better, to be able to make more money, the more they are likely to invest. So we should be looking at it from the economic impact point of view. Because sometimes policymakers or those in government or in bureaucracy, when we are talking about an enabling environment for business, there is this mindset that it's because the private sector wants to make more money for themselves. It is not about that. We need to look beyond that and look at what the private sector is bringing to the table in terms of job creation and in terms of revenue. I think that's a good, so we should have a tax policy that is more investment friendly, where we have proper communication between the taxpayers and the tax authorities.
Now, what about the area of tariff policy? We're talking about the import restrictions and, of course, the forest restrictions.
Well, we have to get it right with our trade policy. Tariff policy is a component of trade policy. And what we have done over the last couple of years is to think in a very narrow way, that it is when you increase tariffs or you impose import prohibition, that is when your industries will grow. To some extent, it can work, especially if you have a lot of backward integration content in industrialization. But more importantly, the emphasis should be on how to build competitive firms, competitive industries, to make industries more competitive. And to make them more competitive, there has to be sectoral engagement with those who are in industry. They can put their fingers straight away on all the impediments to competitiveness. Because the best way to get a sustainable industrialization is not so much about import prohibition, high import tariff, 41 items. Those may be part of it, but that cannot give you a sustainable industrialization or sustainable growth. We should create an environment for those industries to be very competitive, not just to support the domestic market, but also to be part of the global value chain. So that is the strategy that we should use. So we should not be too focused. I'm not saying that we should collapse tariffs, but we should not over-concentrate on tariffs and import restrictions as a way to grow this economy. We should be looking at how to make those industries, whether in agriculture, agro-allied, manufacturing, how to make them more competitive, you know, by dealing with the critical issues, such as critical issues of infrastructure, critical issues of logistics, critical issues of managing the ports, the maritime sector, critical issues of funding. These are some of the things that we need to examine, not just coming up with a list of items that should be put under import prohibition, items that should be put under exclusion list from foreign exchange. No, these are not sustainable solutions. So that is the point.
So what about the area of regulation, having a regulatory environment?
The regulatory environment is very, very critical. And I must acknowledge that the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, under the Vice President, has been doing a lot of work in this area. Each time we engage and we throw up these issues, the Vice President's office engages them. And this is why we also want to emphasize and advise this administration. We should give the Vice President's office more powers to deal with issues of economic management. It is very important, because from our interaction, we have seen that the Vice President's office, as the leader of the economic team, has very clear understanding as to how to move this economy forward. But you can only act to the limits of the powers that you have. So we want to advise that both the PEBEC office and the economic management team should be given more powers, more freedom, and more scope to deal with the issues of the economy. That is very critical in moving this economy forward.
Yeah, when you were talking earlier, you did mention the debt profile.
Yes.
So what do you think government can do differently now in managing our debt profile?
The debt situation is a very, very challenging one. And it also flows from the capacity of government to fund its obligations. If you look at the current budget, 2019 budget, by the time you take our expenditure on recurrent and you take our expenditure on debt service, it has practically covered the entire revenue in the budget, which is just about 6 trillion or so. So when you have that situation, that the only way you can fund your capital expenditure or invest in infrastructure is by borrowing, that is not a sustainable model. So in dealing with, because that is what is escalating the debt. In dealing with the debt issue, first, we need to worry about the cost at which we borrow, particularly domestically. The cost of borrowing is too high. It's leading to the escalation of the debt. It's also creating a crowding out effect on the private sector in the financial market. I'm talking about the rate on treasury bills, the rate on bonds. You can see the migration of investment to treasury bills and bonds. That is not a good thing for the economy. We should have an economy where more resources will be flowing into investment to create jobs and also expand the tax base ultimately. So we should be worried about the cost at which we borrow. We should also identify things that the private sector capital can do. The government cannot do everything. We need to bring in private funding, not borrowing, private equity funding. So we need to identify what projects are bankable. What are those things that the private sector can bring their capital? It could be private sector from within the economy. It could be private sector capital from outside the economy, whichever way. It could even be the diaspora investment. Not borrowing, but equity funding. We identify the projects and we ask them to bring their money. So we have to do that study. So, or if we do that, we'll be able to at least remove some of the some of the burden of financing from the government. And we also need to expand our revenue. Because to reduce your indebtedness, you need to increase your revenue. The way to increase your revenue is to encourage more investment. If the economy is growing, if you have more investment, your tax revenue will increase.
All right.
More jobs will be created.
Okay.
And we also need to get all these independent, some revenue-generating agencies of government to remit better to the federation account.
Okay.
You know, all these things are very critical.
Well, Mr. Muda, we have a few minutes to wrap up this segment, but let's look at the issue of the monetary policy. We're talking about the interest rate policy and foreign exchange policy. Are there things you think the next administration will do better?
First, the foreign exchange policy is a very sensitive area. And this is why, again, I want to reiterate that pronouncements on things like that should be left to those who are managing the economy, not the party officials. Now, exchange rate is a price. Any price is a function of your supply and your demand. So rather than be talking about whether we are going to fix the rate or we should not fix the rate, we should be concentrating more on how to build our export capacity to be able to earn more foreign exchange and how to also manage demand so that we don't have too much pressure on our foreign exchange market. For instance, one key area of demand is the importation of petroleum products. It's consuming about 30% of our foreign exchange earnings. That is not sustainable. On the supply side, we need to encourage more exports. Supporting exporters, removing some of these bottlenecks and all of that, whether in agro-processing or even in the petroleum industry sector. So these are the things that we need to do to ensure that we have a sustainable foreign exchange policy. The same thing with monetary policy. We should have better financial intermediation, where the banking system will support entrepreneurs more, not channeling funds to go and be buying treasury bills and be buying government bonds.
Well,
so these are things that we need to deal with in the area of monetary policy and exchange rate policy.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Muda. Well, let's hope we get it right.
We will get it right by God's grace.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Well, I've been speaking with Muda Yusuf. He's the Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. The trading day is next. After the break, do stay with us.